Kia ora and welcome to the second in our series of keywords in critical media studies. My name is Dr. Luke Munn, and today we'll be looking at algorithm as our keyword. So algorithm has really surged, I think, over the last 5 or 10 years in terms of its usage. We hear all the time about YouTube's algorithm, Facebook's algorithm, but algorithms going wrong or algorithmic bias, these kinds of concepts. So today we're going to talk about what is an algorithm and highlight some key ideas, key issues that we can start to think about when we talk about the algorithm. So firstly, what is an algorithm? An algorithm is usually defined as a set of rules or sometimes as a recipe that is followed. And the idea here is that you're essentially doing a series of steps, a series of actions, a sequence, and by doing those series of steps, by taking X and adding A plus B, dividing it by Y, and so on, then we eventually arrive at an output or outcome, right? And so you might have different inputs that slightly change the output, but essentially you're doing the same kinds of actions, similar sorts of actions each time. So that's why it's usually regarded as sort of this recipe or set of rules that are applied to something. That's actually quite a restrictive understanding of the algorithm, I think, but we can talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm just going to lay out really briefly 3 quick points we can start to think about when we think about the algorithm. So the first is that this idea that the algorithm is novel. Now, we need some caveats here. Certainly, algorithm actually has a really long history, derived from a Persian mathematician, and has a sort of mathematical history attached to it. So we can certainly think about this history in one way. But I think at the same time, we should also acknowledge the fact that algorithmic media and algorithmic platforms and so on do set up new capabilities, new affordances, new features, right? And so it allows corporations, allows organizations to do things that couldn't be done before, or would be much more difficult to do before, right? So we can think about an advertiser, for example. They're really interested in a really particular demographic, a woman over the age of 35 in a certain location in the United States, for example. And before, putting together that demographic would have been very difficult or impossible. You would have to advertise to a much wider subset of people. But because of these algorithmic targeting systems, then you can start to splice together these demographics, these very targeted, hyper-focused demographics in particular ways. And in that sense, you can think about algorithmic publics and the way in which this media spins up new publics that are only available through these data generation sequences, yeah? The same thing then with something like YouTube, for example. YouTube has come under some pressure, some criticism in the last few years for its algorithmic recommendation engine, right? So it's basically looking at what you've seen in the past and what you've enjoyed, and it's using these engagement mechanisms and scoring all the videos that it could show you, and recommending then the ones that it thinks will be most interesting, will give you the most engagement, right? And in that algorithm has been critiqued for recommending maybe polarizing or radicalizing videos, certain kinds of political content, right? So all of these are kind of new dynamics, right? And so then we see in the last decade, particularly, researchers, scholars, really looking at algorithmic media and algorithmic cultures We're trying to understand then what are these new capabilities, what's new, what's old, what's intensified, and how do we make sense of all of this, right? So the algorithm is novel, and then secondly, algorithm is political. So already we've started to gesture to this a little bit, but algorithms are often framed, particularly in tech discourse, popular discourse, journalism, and so on, as objective, right? They're essentially a set of this mathematical formula, a set of weights, a set of computational steps that are taken, and in that sense, they are often framed as being this objective or often quite rational. And you see actually tech companies offloading responsibility by saying, it's just the algorithm. We're not involved in that process. It's just the algorithm making those decisions. So this kind of objective framing, but actually when we think about the algorithm, we always have to remember that it's political. And by political here, I'm not talking about politicians or parties, politics with a big P, right? We're talking about politics as a set of power relations. Who has power, who does not? Who has a voice, who does not? Who is privileged by particular technical systems, and who is bracketed out or ignored or marginalized in certain ways, right? So the algorithm then is highly political. As one quick example, we can think about a widely known algorithm used in recidivism in the justice system, which gives offenders scores about how likely they are to reoffend. And this then is delivered up to judges and provides influence over judges about the kinds of treatment that offenders would get, right? And that algorithm has been shown to be racially biased. It consistently awards higher risk scores to black offenders over white offenders, right? So already we can start to think about the ways in which algorithms contribute to racism, to gendered discrimination, to prejudice, and how they figure into these existing power relations: race, class, gender, religion, ability and disability, and so on, right? And so that's what we mean when we say that algorithm is always already political and needs to be definitely examined for these kinds of influences. Right, so the algorithm is political, and then thirdly, algorithm is ecological. So here I'm not referring to this idea of nature or the earth as such, although we can also think about these environmental impacts, but rather thinking about where does the algorithm end and where does it start? How does it become functional, right? Because when we look at these sort of algorithmically driven platforms, things like Airbnb or Uber and so on, it's clear that it's not just some little mathematical formula at work, right? That this algorithm then is embedded within this much broader structure of hardware, software, the worker's phone, the work themselves, management, sort of business values and these logics wanted by the company, customers, and so on, right? So in order for these algorithms to operate, they don't just stand on their own, but they require this whole kind of ecology, this algorithmic ecology around them, right? And they are influenced by these other aspects. And so this is sort of embedding of this logic then in a broader subset of people and things, values, and so on. And I think this is quite helpful because it allows us then to think about the broader forces at work on the one hand, right? So again, we can think about these sort of imperatives of capitalism, for example. Shareholders want a particular thing from a business, and that those values, those kind of drives, are then embedded in particular ways in an algorithm, and exert kind of certain pressures on workers, for example, right? So there's kind of broader forces, but also then allows us to think about agency. It's clear that the algorithms, this algorithmic media then is a performance in a way, and that performance then requires a sort of compliance by different people, and it also allows then agency, right? We can think about the Uber driver. They don't always respond to this particular call to pick up somebody, but they may defer their choice in order to get a better rate, for example. They might try to gamify their metrics. We see in other work contexts like Amazon, for example, how workers push back against the system. They acquiesce to it in certain ways, but also struggle against it, gamify it, boost their metrics, and so on in other ways, right? So we can think about this kind of broader system then, and I think it provides a kind of a richer analysis, richer understanding of algorithmic media. Right, so the algorithm is novel in some ways, the algorithm is political, and the algorithm is ecological. I hope these provide a kind of a jumping off point, springboards for your own work, your own investigations.